Hi everyone, welcome back to our Ancient and Medieval World lecture series. Today we're going to continue looking at our survey of early Chinese history. We're going to focus in particular on two of the most successful imperial dynasties in the history of China. First, the Han Dynasty, which lasted from the 200s BCE to the early 200s CE or AD. And later, the Tang Dynasty of the early Middle Ages, which lasted from the 600s to the 900s. In both of these, we see successful models for expansionism and the projection of power by a Chinese state that is not only successful in centralizing and ruling the lands from the Yellow River Valley to the Yangtze River Valley, but which also is in contact with the outside world. And which envisions China as a world power, a sort of big brother state that can exert its influence over smaller neighboring kingdoms to the east, south, and west, and which can also engage in international trade across Asia via the Silk Roads, and thereby bring prosperity back to the Chinese Empire. So let's think first about the Han Dynasty. What are some of its major features and what made it successful as a state? We left off with the short-lived unification of China under its first imperial family, the Qin Dynasty, which is essentially the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, and then a very short-lived son in the late 200s BCE. Qin Shi Huangdi died, his son is assassinated, and their deaths plunged China's short-lived empire into civil war. All over the Qin Chinese Empire, there are outbreaks of rebellion against an imperial government that was efficient but deeply unpopular due to its practices of legalist legal system and book burning, harsh punishments of crimes and widespread executions, and the drafting of peasants into government labor projects, including the building of the first Chinese Great Wall. Now, it wasn't inevitable that this centralized system should last. The Qin dynasty was incredibly short-lived. It only ruled over all of China together from 221 to 207 BCE. And the last few years of that period already see widespread rebellion. There was every opportunity for China to revert back into a version of the Warring States period. One of the things that we see as soon as Qin Shi Huangdi dies is that the hereditary nobles who came from different regions of China, who had been assembled in the imperial capital by force and spied on and kept under guard by the emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi. As soon as he's dead, they all take off. They leave the capital. They ride back to the respective regions of China. In particular, a prince named Shang Yu, who was incredibly popular in the Yangtze Valley, rides back down to his regional princedom of Chu, raises an army there, and they immediately set up their own local warlord territories. Basically, those who are able to rally parts of the Qin army to themselves do so. Others just try to raise up armies from the peasants in their own regions. It looks like China is going to split apart. However, the civil wars that fragmented Qin China ended in reunification by 202 BCE. After 5 years of intensive civil war across much of the East Asian landscape, the winner of these civil wars chooses not to try to rule a separatist kingdom, but instead to rebuild a central capital at Chang'an and to set up a better working model on the infrastructure that the Qin dynasty had already built. The winner of the post-Qin civil wars and the man who set up the Han dynasty was a remarkable figure. He's a man who started out as a peasant but ultimately who became the emperor of all under heaven. His name was Liu Bang. Under any other government system earlier in Chinese history, and probably in other parts of the world as well, he would have been relegated to stay a peasant his entire life, farming in the fields in order to support his family at subsistence levels. But he had been a beneficiary of the Qin imperial system. He comes from a county of central China called Han. And in this county of Han, it's taken over by the Qin dynasty. Liu Bang serves in the Qin army as a private soldier. He shows off bravery that impresses his superiors. He ends up getting a promotion, which comes with land and slaves, and he's appointed a local police officer. He does so well in this job that ultimately he's made the governor of his county, and comes to the attention of the imperial court. And by the time the Qin dynasty is crumbling, he's risen to the point where he has military troops at his disposal. He's an important local official. And he coordinates with several other local officials that he knows in his network. He starts to build a coalition that can muster thousands of soldiers. And he's one of the figures involved in overthrowing the son of Qin Shi Huangdi and taking the imperial capital by force. Now, over the course of a civil war, basically Liu Bang managed to outwit and outmaneuver hereditary nobles from some of the older kingdoms in China's southern and eastern regions. He is skilled at the game of divide and conquer. He manages eventually to defeat his main enemy, Shang Yu, in battle, and forces Shang Yu to commit suicide. Once this is done, he comes to power and he calls himself the new emperor of China. He gets support from a wide coalition of county-level leaders and also some of the hereditary aristocrats, in exchange for an important compromise. They recognize him as the new son of heaven, the new emperor of China, the leader of a brand new royal dynasty. He takes a new imperial name. He names his dynasty after his home county of Han. He calls himself Han Gozu as the first Han emperor. But he compromises on the centralization of China that had been one of the hallmarks of China's first dynastic family. Han Gozu, or Liu Bang, realizes that in order to hold together his coalition of Chinese regional leaders, he can't centralize to the full degree that Qin Shi Huangdi had. So he comes up with a plan. The road system is already in place. The army organization is in place. The breakup of China into regions and the setting up of bureaucratic offices and spy networks, that all exists. And he can basically inherit this blueprint and restaff positions that have gone vacant based on people who have been loyal to him during the civil wars. However, in exchange for their cooperation and their refusal to revolt against the new government, he promises noble families in eastern China that they will get to have semi-autonomy. They will owe loyalty to the emperor. They will give a certain amount of annual tribute to the emperor. They will have imperial spies in their territories and send some troops to the imperial army. But they will also get to keep localized police forces, localized legal systems, and they will get to collect some taxes at the local level, which the emperor does not have a right to himself. They will also get prestigious titles and lands, which reward their loyalty to the regime. So basically, Han Imperial China, when it begins in 202 BCE, is divided between a western half and an eastern half. In the western half, there will be the commanderies, or the regional districts that last from the Qin dynasty. Each one will have a governor appointed by the emperor and centralized direct control. That's in the west. But in the eastern half of China, the eastern half is divided into what they call kingdoms. And the eastern half breaks down into different districts that are ruled by kings. They get to keep their own royal courts. They get to intermarry from time to time with members of the emperor's family. And basically you have this tiered system where the kings in the east have relative ability to do what they want. And the governors in the west are more directly controlled by the central government. Now this is a compromise that is forced on the first Han emperor by his position, by the need to unify and bring people together. He also relaxes the legalist law code. There are no more book burnings. Confucianism is allowed to come out into the open again. Within a few reigns, Confucianism will start to supplant legalism. It will start to become, again, the most popular philosophy in China, and Confucian scholars will start to become welcome as government advisors at the imperial court just a few decades into the Han Dynasty. Now, in terms of foreign policy, the preoccupation, once Han Guozhu has unified China, is that he wants to bring greater security to China's northern and northwestern regions. Basically, its frontier with the Gobi Desert in the north and the semi-desert, semi-arid regions and oases to China's northwest, which stretch out across Central Asia. In these regions, Chinese states had had a fractious and violent relationship for centuries with nomadic tribes, especially a tribe called the Xiongnu, who are probably related to the Huns, the peoples known in Western Europe from a branch of them that migrates to the west during the later time of the Roman Empire. Now, the Xiongnu pose major military problems for the kingdoms of northern and northwestern China. They breed and ride horses, whereas the farmers of China's river valleys and the kingdoms and armies that develop to protect them are centered around military ideas of infantry warfare. Most Chinese armies are made up of foot soldiers drafted from China's peasants. They are slow-moving, and they have a hard time competing with the more mobile nomadic armies of the peoples of northern and central Asia. When China is unified, Qin Shi Huangdi's solution to the nomad threat is to try to build a great wall across northern China. He only succeeds in building parts of this network, but that doesn't really successfully keep nomadic raiders out. Han Guozhu continues repairing and trying to build more forts in parts of northern and northwestern China, trying to build more sections of the Great Wall. This still is not effective in keeping the nomads from raiding into northern China and collecting tribute and slaves. When Han Guozhu tries to lead the Imperial Chinese army against the nomads, he gets outmaneuvered, his army is actually defeated, and he's forced into a peace treaty in which he gives his own daughter as the wife to the king of the Huns. By the end of his reign, Han Guozhu has built an imperial blueprint, but the Han project is not yet finished. Han Guozhu himself dies after only 7 years on the throne. He finds that he has trouble convincing the semi-independent kings in the east to give him the soldiers and money he wants to fight his wars in the northwest. And after 7 years of reign in 195 BCE, Han Guozhu is actually killed or mortally wounded trying to enforce his control over one of the eastern kings. However, the subsequent Han emperors gradually engage in reforms, manage to build up political networks that help them eventually to outmaneuver the kings in the eastern part of their empire. In the later 100s BCE, an important Han ruler named Han Wudi comes to power and has a long reign over many decades. Han Wudi is important internally because he manages to increase government control over the eastern half of China. Basically, he builds up large enough military forces that he no longer feels insecure in dealing with the eastern kings. And he actually takes away a number of the privileges that they had been given by the first Han emperor. In particular, in the 140s, he takes away the rights of the eastern kings to collect their own taxes. And while he leaves them ceremonial titles, he increasingly replaces people in the job of king with members of his own extended family, and basically sets up a system where the imperial government has much greater control in the east than it once did. Now, in the west, on the Central Asian front, Han Wudi is militarily successful. He reforms China's army. Based on China's experience with the nomads, he buys vast numbers and breeds large numbers of horses. And he creates a more cavalry-based army, especially with large units of mounted crossbowmen that can pursue the nomads, that can fight them in their own territory using some of their own methods. The Han army, after Han Wudi's reforms, is successful in defeating the Xiongnu, the Huns, in battle. It manages to defeat their chiefs and force them to pay taxes in various agricultural goods, or especially horses and other herd animals, to the Chinese imperial authorities. When Han Wudi's armies defeat the Huns, they then push further west. They capture one oasis after another, and eventually they expand through Central Asia, almost all the way to what is now Afghanistan. This is a critical period in China's imperial development. Basically, it marks the leap from being a regional power in East Asia to being a larger world empire with awareness of the outside world. The campaigns of Han Wudi's generals put China in direct contact with the Parthian dynasty of Iran. And they begin the real period of what we know as the Silk Road trade. From the 100s BCE on, for many, many centuries to come, China would be engaged in overland trade across Central Asia to India and the Middle East. And eventually, by the late Han dynasty in the 100s CE, Chinese embassies and merchants would even make long-distance contact with people in the Mediterranean world. And supposedly Chinese merchants would actually reach the court of imperial Rome under Marcus Aurelius. So China is now a world power with a worldwide reach. And this is a major stage in their development and prosperity. At the height of Han imperial power, Han cities grow. They're enriched by trade. You see a flourishing in education, in the sciences, the arts, and literature. And it becomes, for a couple of centuries, one of the great successful periods of Chinese imperial history. Now, the Han dynasty finally collapsed in the early 200s CE. After a period of large-scale floods and environmental damage in southern China in the early first millennium, and a series of peasant revolts that followed afterwards, as you start to see a concentration of wealth among large-scale landowners or in the cities, but that doesn't trickle down to the masses in the countryside. Now, eventually in the 200s CE, civil wars among generals in the Han army overthrew the imperial family and led to a period of regional kingdoms and warlordism known as the Age of Division. From the 200s to the 500s CE, exactly the same period when the Roman Empire is fragmenting in the Mediterranean world. The Han dynasty falls, and China fragments again into warring kingdoms, into separate states. But unlike Rome, China has 3 centuries of fragmentation and division, but then goes back to the centralizing model. There are a number of features of the war, the age of division that are important. Socially, probably the most important feature is that the education system stays in place. Confucian-based education continues. You don't have the sort of total economic breakdown that you see in the Roman world in the 200s CE. And in addition to the continuation of the social system in many of China's cities, you also have a new feature. As trade continues with outside groups, during the Age of Division, large numbers of Buddhist missionaries bring the Buddhist faith from northern India into China. And they begin to establish monasteries in many of the different regions of China with the encouragement of the local authorities. Local leaders in different parts of China try to gain prestige for themselves by getting the backing of local Buddhist monks and missionaries. And just as we've seen in other parts of the world, in the Roman world, as we see rulers trying to gain a new legitimacy by connecting themselves to the rising Christian church, you can see similar processes happening with the explosion of Buddhism and its popularity in China during this early medieval period. Now, China is reunified again by military force, by a regional royal family called the Sui Dynasty, who managed to defeat their enemies, rebuild a central capital, and try to put together a system of central command again in the 500s. The Sui Dynasty is short-lived. It's only two rulers, both of them are assassinated. But the Tang Dynasty that overthrows them then manages to rule all of China for 3 centuries. The Tang Dynasty, in many ways, builds on the Han imperial model. Basically, they're a successor state, but they have an educational system, they have a road network, they have an infrastructure system that they've inherited from the previous Chinese empires. And they're able to basically reunify China, retake control over the Silk Road in the West, and use that to bring prosperity back to China's cities. There are a number of important features of the Tang period, which lasts from the early 600s to the early 900s CE. First of all, inside China, we see greater measures of social unification taking place. The Tang emperors complete a new building project envisioned by the Sui emperors in the late 500s, which is known as the Grand Canal. Basically, this is a water network more than 1,200 miles long that unites the Yellow River in the north with the Yangtze River in the south. This allows an increase in maritime trade between southern China and northern China. And this also allows a greater sense of social unity between regions of the country that have hitherto been divided by their different climates and dialects and food patterns. Probably most importantly in social terms, we see the movement of tea, local beverage in southern China that then moves in trade up the Grand Canal and becomes the national beverage by the middle of the Tang Dynasty. We also see in the period of Tang imperial prosperity a liberal attitude towards the promotion of ethnic minorities from China's neighboring regions. People who move into China's cities from outer regions and districts, or who come into the orbit of the Tang Empire and then serve in the Tang army and then move into China proper, are rewarded with civic and bureaucratic roles, with positions in the court, and with extensive land ownership in Tang society. So we have a multicultural empire, really for the first time in Tang China, that includes people from Korea, from Japan, from Tibet, that includes Hunnic and Turkic groups from Central Asia in the west, in this large empire under the Tang Sons of Heaven. There are a number of important features of Tang foreign policy. Basically, they develop a tribute system in which developing smaller kingdoms in surrounding parts of Asia establish diplomatic contact, have embassies at the Tang court, and vice versa. They model their own governments on the Tang system, and they pay tribute to the Tang emperor. So Tang China has an enormous amount of influence on the development of smaller neighboring kingdoms in Japan, in the Shilla Kingdom of Korea, in northern Vietnam, and in Tibet. To the west, the Tang emperors, especially the most famous military leader of the Tang, the Emperor Li Shimin, they defeat Turkish tribes to the west of China and reestablish direct control over the roadways and fortresses of the Silk Road. Again, they spread their power all the way to parts of what's now Afghanistan in the west. The most famous, the last great ruler of the Tang dynasty is China's most famous female ruler, a woman named Wu Zhao, who rules China from 660 to 705 for 45 years at the height of Tang imperial prosperity. Wu Zhao is another fascinating historical figure. She began her career at the imperial court as a teenage concubine, a sex slave brought into the imperial harem. She managed to seduce the emperor Li Shimin and then his son, winning their affections away from their wives. Eventually, she becomes an official imperial wife. The emperor divorces and executes his own wife to marry Wu Zhao instead, and then the emperor has a stroke. And she rules on his behalf for years, and then on behalf of her sons. When they get old enough to rule, she throws them in prison and continues to rule, and manages to oversee Tang China at the height of its prosperity. Eventually, though, after Wu Zhao's death and in the middle of the 700s, Tang China experiences a number of military failures and then peasant rebellions that lead to a return to fragmentation and decline. Key events in the decline of Tang China are a defeat in the west at the end of the Silk Road around 750 at the hands of a Persian Muslim army of the Abbasid dynasty. Basically, the Chinese empire at this point runs up against the expanding Arab empire. They have a battle at the River Talas in Central Asia. The Chinese lose the battle. And as a result of that, they start to lose control over some of their western Silk Road outposts. Shortly after this, there is a rebellion in the mid-750s led by a disgruntled army general named An Lushan. That lasts for many years. It's very destructive. Enormous numbers of people die. The rebels, led by An Lushan, storm the imperial capital and manage to kick out the emperor, but An Lushan is then assassinated by one of his own sons in a family dispute. And ultimately, the dynasty manages to hang on. However, after this point, there are repeated local peasant rebellions and outbreaks of civil war. In the 800s, in an effort to try to revive the dynasty, they engage in a sort of intellectual backlash, discriminating against ethnic minorities who have settled in China, trying to outlaw Buddhism after it had become a widely popular religion, and trying to blame foreigners and Buddhists for China's ills. Ultimately, that inward-looking sort of isolationist focus of the later Tang dynasty does not manage to rescue the imperial government, and it falls from power in a coup in the year 907 CE.